Let me tell you a story. Let's begin our conversation today in the Age of Enlightenment. The Age of Enlightenment. You know, those who have chronicled human history on this planet, historians and academics and scholars and scribes, have classified human history into different periods. We know that. Different ages, if you will. And so we have what is called the Bronze Age and the Iron Age, the Stone Age and the Dark Age and the Middle Ages. We have what is characterized, that's a key word, as prehistory and ancient history, post-classical history, modern history, and contemporary history. So I want us to focus now in on the early modern period of human history. And this is roughly, loosely considered to be the years between 15 and 1800, those 300 or so years. And focusing even further, I want to pitch a tent and camp out for a bit in what is called the Age of Enlightenment, which is, I would say, roughly the 100 years between 17 and 1800. Some call this 100 or so years the Age of Reason, and it is widely regarded as the century of philosophy. And so, brothers and sisters, let us travel back to the world of ideas in 18th century Europe. Specifically in France, this period was characterized by the phrase dare to know. And many of the leading thinkers and philosophers and researchers and writers and my favorites, the Freemasons of that time, often circulated their ideas and their thoughts through meetings at sort of scientific academies and at Masonic lodges and what they called literary salons and coffee houses, and through, of course, printed books and pamphlets. And what is key and significant about this emerging world of ideas, these developing thoughts and philosophies, is that they often undermined the authority of the ruling monarchy at that time. And in many cases, many times, this world of ideas was often at odds with and totally contrary to the established teachings of the Catholic Church. So many of those leading thinkers and philosophers that I was telling you about, and the researchers and the writers and the Freemasons at that time, the ones that were circulating those ideas in those meetings at the scientific academies and at the Masonic lodges and the literary salons and coffee houses, a lot of them had backgrounds in science and mathematics and physics and astronomy and biology and chemistry. So among them, there emerged this hunger, this thirst for recovering some of the lost knowledge of the ancients. And thus we got some of the new discoveries of that era by Copernicus and Galileo and Isaac Newton. And it was also around this time that some of those researchers began to advance scientific ideas and theories under headings, these were new headings at that time, of natural philosophy and natural history, looking more closely at the origins of man's chemical and biological and geological and anatomical nature. So these men began to examine the nature of mankind. And that now brings us, brothers and sisters, to Sweden and to one of its native-born sons, botanist, physician, and zoologist, Mr. Carl Linnaeus. First, he formalized the modern system of naming organisms using both their genus and species name. And that system we know today as binomial nomenclature. Binomial, bi meaning two, and nomial meaning name. So two names to characterize and classify plants and animals. So what does that look like? That's how we got Homo sapiens, two names, one genus, one species. That's how we got Homo erectus, two names to categorize and classify. These are examples of binomial nomenclature. So that's one thing. The second thing Brother Carl Linnaeus is known for, in 1735, he published the book Systema Naturae, or The System of Nature. And in that book, Carl Linnaeus classified thousands of species species of animals and plants. And what he also did was he described human beings just as he described any other plant or animal. And he did this by examining several monkeys and noting the similarities between the monkeys and man. And Carl Linnaeus pointed out that both species basically have the same anatomy, except for speech. He found no other differences between monkeys and man. So in his book, Systema Naturae, he placed man and monkeys under the same category. And he called this category anthropomorpha. Anthropomorpha, meaning man-like. And eventually, in later editions of Systema Naturae, we, mankind, were classified as primates instead of anthropomorpha, and humans were given the full binomial of Homo sapiens. So that's how we got there. Now here's where it gets really interesting, brothers and sisters. In the first edition of Systema Naturae, and that would be the 1735 publishing of the book, Carl Linnaeus subdivided the human species into 4 varieties based on continent and skin color. Now this is 1735. Carl Linnaeus, of Swedish birth, a European man, subdivided the human species into 4 varieties. Number 1, Europaeus albus. Europaeus albus, also known as white European. Number 2, Americanus rubescens. Americanus rubescens, also known as the red American. Americanus rubescens, the red American. Number 3, Asiaticus fuscus. Asiaticus fuscus, also known as the brown Asian, which was subsequently changed in the 10th edition of the book, which was published in 1758. Asiaticus fuscus was changed to Asiaticus luridus, also known as the yellow Asian. So that's how we got there. And number 4, Africanus niger. Africanus niger, also known as the Black African. Africanus niger. Now we know today that Niger is a country in West Africa. Some people say Niger. And the history of that country dates way back into what is known as prehistory. So the first publication of Systema Naturae by Carl Linnaeus was in 1735, as I've said, and in the 10th edition of the book, which again was published in 1758, Carl Linnaeus went even further by detailing stereotypical characteristics for each of those 4 varieties of the species of man. All of those characteristics based on the concept of the 4 temperaments from classical Greco-Roman antiquity. Loosely, they are sanguine, which means enthusiastic, active, and social. Number 2 of the 4 temperaments, choleric, which means short-tempered, fast, or irritable. Number 3, melancholic, which means analytical, wise, and quiet. And the 4th of the 4 temperaments, phlegmatic, which means relaxed and peaceful. And so here's how he added those 4 varieties of the species of man. This is the descriptions that he added next to those 4 categorizations that he had done earlier in a previous edition of the book. Next to the Americanus, he wrote red, choleric, righteous, black, straight, thick hair, stubborn, zealous, free, painting himself with red lines, and regulated by customs. That's what he wrote next to Americanus. Next to Europeanus, he wrote white, sanguine, with abundant long hair, blue eyes, gentle, acute, inventive, covered with close vestments, and regulated by customs. And next to the Asiaticus, he wrote yellow, melancholic, stiff, black hair, dark eyes, severe, haughty, greedy, covered with loose clothing, and regulated by opinions. And next to the Africanus, he wrote black, phlegmatic, relaxed, black frizzled hair, silky skin, flat nose, tumid lips, that means swollen, females without shame, mammary glands give milk abundantly, crafty, sly, careless, anoints himself with grease, and regulated by will. Now these are the characteristics of the black man and black woman as listed in the year 1758 by Carl Linnaeus in his book Systema Naturae. And this, brothers and sisters, is one of the deep roots of race and racism as we know it today. Let me tell you a story. Let's begin today in the year 1775 in the country of Germany at the University of Göttingen, or Göttingen, Gottingen, University of Göttingen. A young man studying medicine there in 1775 publishes his thesis called On the Natural Variety of Mankind. On the Natural Variety of Mankind. And in his thesis, this young man explored the classification of human races based upon craniological research. Craniological being, just what you think, being the study of the hard casing enclosing the human brain, that being the human skull. So in his 1775 medical doctoral thesis, this young man began to look at the size and shape of the human skull, and he began to draw some conclusions. And I want to underscore here right off the break that this gentleman was not studying the brain itself. He was studying the hard material encasing and closing the brain. He was studying the size and shape of the human skull. That is an important fact and distinction to keep in your mind and in your consciousness as we delve deeper into this conversation. So again, that was in 1775. And in 1779, some 4 years later, this same young man, based upon his continued cranial research, he divided the human species into 5 races based upon his examination of skulls. 5 human races. And he broke down those races as follows. Number 1, the Caucasian or white race. Number 2, the Mongolian or yellow race, including all East Asians and some Central Asians. Number 3, the Malayan or brown race, including Southeast Asian and Pacific Islander. Number 4, the Ethiopian or black race, including sub-Saharan Africans. Number 5, the American or red race, including American Indians. And again, all of this was based upon this young man's craniological research, all right? His study of the human skull. And his name was Johann Friedrich Blumenbach, a German national, a man of European descent, a physician, physiologist, and anthropologist. In 1779, Blumenbach divided the human species into 5 races, all based upon his research and observations of about 60 human skulls. So let that sink in a bit, brothers and sisters. Now, at that point in the development of thought, in the world of ideas in European society, in that period that is called, as we discussed last time, the Age of Enlightenment or the Age of Reason, there had emerged at that time 2 predominant philosophies as to the origins of humankind. First, there were those who took the biblical view. No surprise there. Those that believe that human beings are one species and that race represents variations in and variations of that one human species. That's the Bible view. And that belief was known as monogenism or monogenism. Mono being one and Genesis meaning origin, so one origin. And so these folks were known as monogynous, believing in one human species with lots of variation within that one species. And then you had the second group of people. And those folks believed that human beings evolved from several independent pairs of ancestors. And this was known as polygenism. Poly being many and Genesis being origin, so many origins. And these folks were known as polygynous or polygynous, meaning they believed that human beings evolved from multiple species. And this group would later be known as, maybe you've heard this term, pluralists. Now, Johann Friedrich Blumenbach, who studied the human skulls and based upon that research divided mankind into 5 races, Blumenbach subscribed to monogenism or monogenism, and he was considered a monogenist. And he argued in his work that listen to this, brothers and sisters, he argued in his work that human physical characteristics like skin color and cranial profile depended on geography and diet and mannerism. So Johann Friedrich Blumenbach, he held to what is called the degenerative hypothesis of racial origins. Well, what is the degenerative hypothesis? Blumenbach believed that Adam and Eve were Caucasians dwelling in Asia and that other races, quote unquote, degenerated from this original white stock as a result of environmental factors like geography and the cold of the wind in Europe and the heat of the sun in sub-Saharan Africa and the varying quality of available food sources, let's say in North, Central, and South Americas. All these factors would help and contribute to to the degeneration of the races from this original Caucasian white stock. Now get this. Blumenbach also believed that this whole, this makes me laugh, this whole degenerative process could be reversed. That in the right environment and under the right circumstances and with the proper diet, that all forms of man, all the quote unquote degenerated races like Negroes and Eskimos and the Chinese and American Indians, they could all be reverted back to the original Caucasian race. And I will remind you here, brothers and sisters, at this point, that Johann Friedrich Blumenbach was a respected scientist of his day. So this work brought forward by Johann Friedrich Blumenbach is another deep root of racism. And that is not to say, I want to be very clear about this, that is not to say that Brother Blumenbach himself was racist or that his ideas were or are inherently racist. The point I want to make here is that the introduction of these ideas and philosophies into polite society during the time of the scientific revolution leading into the Age of Enlightenment in the early modern period of human history. These ideas, in the name of science, racist or not, allowed for those who were overtly racist, those ideas allowed racists to co-opt those scientific findings by Blumenbach and to use those ideas in the name of science to further an overtly racist political, social, and scientific agenda at that time, and to impose and inflict those racist ideas onto the larger society in which they lived. It is the co-opting of ideas in the name of science to perpetuate a racist political agenda. That's the larger point that I would like to make here. So for the past few conversations, we have been talking about the deep roots of racism, and the work of Johann Friedrich Blumenbach, brothers and sisters, is yet another deep root of racism in our contemporary society. The last time we were together, we pulled up another deep root of racism in discussing the work of Mr. Carl Linnaeus, who was the first of the Age of Enlightenment philosophers to describe human beings just as he described any other plant or animal. And as we discussed last time, he did that by examining several monkeys and noting the similarities between the monkeys and man. And Carl Linnaeus pointed out that both species basically have the same anatomy, except for speech. And he found no other differences between monkeys and man. And Carl Linnaeus went on to, as we discussed, subdivide the human species into 4 varieties. Now, he did his work based on continent, so where these people were located, and skin color. And he later further detailed what he saw as the stereotypical characteristics for each of those 4 varieties of the species of man. And Carl Linnaeus did all of that. He did his work around the time of 1758. He is the first deep root of racism that we have discussed and dug up. And today we add the work of Johann Friedrich Blumenbach, who, as we have stated, divided humankind into 4 races based upon his craniological research, the study of human skulls. And Blumenbach did the bulk of his work around the time of 1779. So he is the second deep root of racism that I'm putting on the table for further research and reflection this morning. Carl Linnaeus and Johann Friedrich Blumenbach are 2 of the deep roots of racism, if you dig back far enough and deep enough. And their work is at the foundation of how we perceive race and experience racism in contemporary society. Let me tell you a story. Let us now turn to the antebellum American science scene and to a native son of the city of brotherly love. At age 17, this young man began attending lectures at the University of Pennsylvania Medical School, and he went on to earn his first medical degree from that school in 1820. And shortly thereafter, this young man became a member of the Academy of Natural Sciences of Philadelphia. And in 1824, he began his medical practice in Philadelphia, and it wasn't too long before he became a rising star in the local medical community, eventually joining the Pennsylvania Medical College in Philadelphia as a professor of anatomy. And in 1830, this young professor was preparing a lecture titled "The Different Forms of the Skull as Exhibited in the 5 Races of Men." The different forms of the skull as exhibited in the 5 races of men. That was his lecture topic, which was a throwback to the work of German anatomist Johann Friedrich Blumenbach. Well, our young professor realized while prepping this lecture that he really didn't have enough illustrations of skulls to thoroughly exemplify each group he wanted to discuss, and thus began his lifelong quest to acquire as many human skulls from all across the planet as he possibly could. This man's name was Samuel George Morton, and in the year 1839, in pre-Civil War America, Samuel George Morton published a book called Crania Americana, also known as a comparative view of the skulls of various Aboriginal nations of North and South America. This book was largely a study of Native American or American Indian skulls. And this work was widely praised as revolutionary, in large part because of the 71 beautiful, in fact, quite stunning lithograph illustrations contained in the book. So for the first time, the world could actually see in minute detail the unique characteristics of human skull formations from a vast array of skull samples that Samuel George Morton had by that time begun to collect from people all over the world. Now, Crania Americana is also significant because Samuel George Morton continued the classification system begun by Johann Friedrich Blumenbach of ranking the human races by cranial capacity. And in Morton's work, in descending order of human skull volume, he prioritized Caucasians first, Mongolians second, Malaysians third, Native Americans fourth, and Negroes fifth. Samuel George Morton noted the Caucasian race, these are his notes on the Caucasian race, quote, distinguished by the facility with which it attains the highest intellectual endowments, end quote. Morton noted of Native Americans, quote, averse to cultivation and slow in acquiring knowledge, restless, revengeful, and fond of war, and wholly destitute of maritime adventure, end quote. Of the Ethiopians or Negroes, Morton wrote, quote, is joyous, flexible, and indolent, meaning lazy. While the many nations which compose this race present a singular diversity of intellectual character, of which the far extreme is the lowest grade of humanity, end quote. So that was Samuel George Morton's first work on his craniological research, Crania Americana. Now, his second work, based upon his craniological research, was called Crania Egyptica. Crania Egyptica. That's the archaic spelling of Egypt. And this book was also known as Observations on Egyptian Ethnography Derived from Anatomy, History, and the Monuments. Observations on Egyptian Ethnography derived from anatomy, history, and the monuments, but its most popular name was Crania Egyptica. And this second book was published in 1844. And in this study, Samuel George Morton sought to prove that the distinct racial differences shown in modern Caucasoid, meaning European white folks, and Negroid, meaning African black folks, that their crania, their skulls, those differences were equally as present and as obvious in antiquity as well as they are in modern day society. So in other words, European white folks have always been superior to African black folks based upon the size, the overall volume of their human skull formations. And so Morton's conclusion in his book Crania Egyptica was that the ruling, now just sit down, brothers and sisters, and take a big deep breath for this one. So Morton's conclusion in his book Crania Egyptica was that the ruling elite of ancient Egypt had been Caucasian, while the subservient class had been Negroid. So just let that sink in. And I will say here, just to take it off script for a minute, I will say this. That's true, depending upon what time in history you look. When the Greeks came in 325 BC or so and took over Egypt, it was at its decline. It was in the 25th, 28th dynasty by that point. So you would have white folks from Greece at 325. And after that, you would have Italians on the thrones and running Egypt closer toward Christ. So that is true if you go to 325 BC. Now, when you start creeping back into 1000 BC and 2000 BC and 3000 BC, just remember this, brothers and sisters. Just remember this when you study human history. The farther back you go, the blacker it gets. Okay? The farther back you go, the blacker it gets. These scientific claims coming from Samuel George Morton, this was all that his contemporary American and European colleagues, this is all they needed to continue justifying and defending the horrific practice of American chattel slavery that was ever present at that time in our history in this country. So Morton's belief, and it is important here to underscore that by this time he had become a prominent physician and a very well-respected natural scientist. Samuel George Morton's belief that enslavement of blacks by whites had roots in antiquity. This belief system fueled a larger political argument for a natural order of racial hierarchy. That's important. And I will wrap this all up, brothers and sisters, with this little bow right here. When Samuel George Morton died in 1851, at age 52, the Charleston, South Carolina Medical Journal published a memoir. And here's what they said, quote, "We can only say that we of the South should consider him as our benefactor for aiding most materially in giving to the Negro his true position as an inferior race," end quote. We can only say that we of the South should consider him as our benefactor for aiding most materially in giving to the Negro his true position as an inferior race. We have been digging up the historical roots of race as we perceive it today, and racism as we experience it in this contemporary matrix. And brothers and sisters, the work of Samuel George Morton is yet another deep historical root of racism. By virtue of the huge collection of human skulls in his possession, which far exceeded the number that Johann Friedrich Blumenbach had studied. And because Morton was able to so beautifully illustrate his skulls using the, at that time, newly developed technique of lithography, Samuel George Morton was able to take the breadth and scope of Blumenbach's cranial research to a whole other level. And what is also significant about Samuel George Morton is that he was not European born. He was not. He was an American from Philadelphia. And to this very day, Samuel George Morton is often thought of as the originator of American school ethnography. Ethnography being that school of thought in antebellum, meaning pre-Civil War, American science that claimed the difference between humans was one of species, polygenism. And to this very day, Samuel George Morton is seen by some as one of the American originators, if not the American originator of scientific racism. Scientific racism. Now, the last time we were together, we pulled up another deep root of racism in discussing the work of Johann Friedrich Blumenbach, who was, as I've laid out here, a bit of a mentor to, and certainly had an influence on Mr. Samuel George Morton. And before that, we discussed the work of Mr. Carl Linnaeus, who was the first of the Age of Enlightenment philosophers to describe human beings just as he described any other plant or animal. And Carl Linnaeus went on to subdivide the human species into 4 varieties based on continent and skin color. And as we talked about later, detailed what he saw as the stereotypical characteristics for each of those 4 varieties of the human species of man. So to recap, brothers and sisters, we have so far traced our deep historical roots of racism to 2 Europeans, Carl Linnaeus and Johann Friedrich Blumenbach. And today we add 1 American, Samuel George Morton. Let me tell you a story. All right, so go with me here to the year 1846. In the autumn of 1846, a 39-year-old European man, a biologist and geologist by trade, he crossed the Atlantic by request and with some grant money in his pockets. He crossed the Atlantic to give a series of 12 lectures on the plan of creation as shown in the animal kingdom. That was his lecture title, The Plan of Creation as Shown in the Animal Kingdom. And he was to give this lecture at the Lowell Institute in Boston, Massachusetts. And during his first few months in America, this 39-year-old European man traveled to, among other places, the city of Philadelphia. And there in Philadelphia, he met and came to admire Mr. Samuel George Morton. Now, at that time in 1846, our 39-year-old European man, having been raised in the old world and now making his first visit to America, he was a monogenist. He believed at that time that all human beings share a common origin and over time evolved into different varieties of the same one human species. So our guy in America, more specifically now he's in the city of Philadelphia, for the first time in his life, he experiences black people, Negroes, as we were called at that time. And in a letter to his mother, who was still back in Old World Europe, he wrote about his initial encounter with black people. And here's what he wrote. It was in Philadelphia that I first found myself in prolonged contact with Negroes. All the domestics in my hotel were men of color. I can scarcely express to you the painful impression that I received, especially since the sentiment that they inspired in me is contrary to all our ideas about the confraternity of the human type and the unique origin of our species. But truth before all. Nevertheless, I experienced pity at the sight of this degraded and degenerate race, and their lot inspired compassion in me in thinking that they are really men. Nonetheless, it is impossible for me to repress the feeling that they are not of the same blood as us. In seeing their black faces with their thick lips and grimacing teeth, the wool on their head, their bent knees, their elongated hands, their large curved nails, and especially the livid color of the palms of their hands, I could not take my eyes off their faces in order to tell them to stay far away. And when they advanced that hideous hand towards my plate in order to serve me, I wished I were able to depart in order to eat a piece of bread elsewhere, rather than to dine with such service. What unhappiness for the white race to have tied their existence so closely with that of Negroes in certain countries. God preserve us from such a contact. That's what he wrote to his mother in 1846. So this 39-year-old European man who was so viscerally repulsed by his first sight and experience of Negroes in a Philadelphia hotel in 1846, this man's name was Louis Agassiz, A-G-A-S-S-I-Z. Louis Agassiz went on to establish and became the head of the Lawrence Scientific School at Harvard University in 1847. And it was during that same year, 1847, that Agassiz visited the American South for the first time, and he traveled there to give a series of lectures in Charleston, South Carolina. And it was there in Charleston that Louis Agassiz, for the first time, got to observe Negroes, Africans, black folks, working in the cotton fields and in the cities of that region. And it was also around this time that the craniological research of Samuel George Morton began to more heavily influence Louis Agassiz's thinking about the racial differences in human beings. And this shift in thinking led him to conclude that Negroes and whites were a physiologically and anatomically distinct species. So Louis Agassiz had effectively been converted from a monogenist into a polygenist. And Agassiz began to write extensively on the classification of the races on the basis of specific climatic zones, or what was referred to as zoological provinces, where each race was endowed with attributes unique to their survival in that particular zone. So in his reasoning and analysis, Negroes were peculiar to the hot and dry zone, Caucasians to the temperate zone, and Eskimos to the Arctic zone. And the attributes of each of these races was unequal. Caucasians were superior to Negroes, to black folks. So in 1848, during the annual meeting of the National Academy of Sciences in Philadelphia, Samuel George Morton examined a South African Khoisan, meaning being a member of the Xhosa people or the Xhosa tribe in South Africa. Some of you will know the Xhosas by the clicking that they do in their speech pattern. So Samuel George Morton examined a Xhosa youth named Henry in 1848. And he later commissioned a photo of Henry to be shot in profile for the sole purpose of comparing his African skull formation to that of Europeans. Now, that photo of that South African boy named Henry from the Xhosa tribe is the first known phrenological photograph, meaning the study of the shape and size of the cranium. That is the first chronological photo known to be in existence. And Samuel George Morton later gave that photo of Henry's portrait to Louis Agassiz as a gift. And a few years later, in 1850, Louis Agassiz was once again in Charleston, South Carolina. He would go there every winter to lecture. So in 1850, he was there lecturing. And while there, he received an invitation from one of the great slave-holding families in that region, a man named Robert W. Gibbs. And Mr. Gibbs invited Louis Agassiz to visit some of the prominent plantations in the area as an opportunity for Louis Agassiz to observe and document what he called pure races from Africa. And on those tours, Louis Agassiz began examining the bodies of African slaves who worked those plantations. And he selected slaves from the Igbo, the Fulat, the Gullah, the Guinea, the Coromantee, the Mandrigo, and from the Congo. Those were some of the tribes and regions in Africa from which these slaves had originated. And Agassiz commissioned a professional photographer named Joseph T. Zeely, who had a studio in that area. Agassiz hired Joseph T. Zeely to photograph these slaves that he had selected from these plantations that he had been visiting. Now, this was around the same time of the development of the photographic technique called the daguerreotype. The daguerreotype. And the daguerreotype was a process employing an iodine-sensitized silver plate and mercury vapor to produce a photographic image. And the daguerreotype process was introduced in 1839 by a Frenchman named Louis-Jacques Monde Daguerre. So in 1850, when Louis Agassiz commissioned the photographs of the slaves on those Charleston, South Carolina plantations, the images coming out of those photo shoots were 15 daguerreotypes. Now, for me, these photographs are hard to look at, especially when you consider that Louis Agassiz portrayed all of his slave subjects, most certainly against their own free will, either completely nude, as semi-nude torsos, in full body, or in fixed poses, either front, back, or side profiles. That's how he shot them. And the names of those beloved brothers and sisters of ours, those slave ancestors of ours, their names were, and I speak these names with great respect and reverence. Their slave names were Alfred, Jem, Jem, Jack, and Jack's daughter Drana, Drana, Fasina, Fassena, and Renty, Renty, and Renty's daughter Delia, Delia. And I say they're hard to look at for me because they are degrading and humiliating, especially when I reflect on the fact that the women were made to let down their blouses to expose their breasts to be photographed, and the men were made to stand completely naked, front and back, to be photographed, all for the purpose of comparing their physical features to those of Caucasians, to prove to the world through photographs that Negroes, black people, were an inferior people as compared to their European standard of beauty and intelligence. And those 1850 slave daguerreotypes, commissioned by Louis Agassiz, became a legacy piece for him, as Louis Agassiz became one of the first scientists, if not the first scientist, to commission the use of the camera for the sole purpose of documenting racial differences. And Louis Agassiz went on to become a professor of zoology and geology at Harvard, and he founded the Museum of Comparative Zoology there in 1859 and served as that museum's first director, and he held that position until he died in 1873. And that museum, brothers and sisters, is still operational at Harvard University to this very day.